essentially, anybody who touches product at Voodoo, we want them to be able to become a millionaire in around 3-4 years if they make a good product.
Gabriel Rivaud, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, I'm happy to be here.
Can I introduce you?
Please do.
All right. Gabriel, you've been at Voodoo for 8 years. You are heading gaming as a VP of gaming.
That's correct.
And for those who don't know Voodoo, I mean, everybody knows Voodoo, but here's some stats about Voodoo. 600 million in revenue in 2023, 100 million in EBITDA, 7 billion in lifetime downloads, probably way more than that, but let's round it down to 7 billion. 150 million in MAU, 750 full-time employees, out of which 500 work on games.
That's correct.
Did I leave anything out?
No, it's all good.
We're here in Paris, let's say that.
Indeed, in our offices.
Yes, in your beautiful offices. So we're here to talk about a lot of different things. We'll talk about hyper-casual, we'll talk about hybrid casual. I'm very, very interested in understanding just how do you run a scalable business for such a long time. And I'm very interested in how the business has evolved, because when I look at your, this morning I just looked at your quarterly downloads just on Sensor Tower, and I put in like 2018, 2020, 2022, and then the latest quarter, Q1 in 24. It went from about 350 million downloads in 2018 per quarter, then up to 500 million downloads in 2020 when everything is booming, down to 150 million downloads in 2022, and now hovering around 130, kind of scaled to less than a third from the peak years. What happened?
Yeah, so that really reflects our change in business model, because we started in 2013 working on hyper-casual games, and we transitioned towards hybrid casual games. We started in 2018 and fully transitioned in 2022. As of 2023, 50% of our revenue comes from in-app purchase, not anymore from ads, the hyper-casual business. And our hyper-casual games, that we don't build any more hyper-casual games since around 4 years, but the portfolio still generates 25% of revenue. The rest now comes from the new generation of hybrid casual games. So hyper-casual games used to make a lot of downloads, but monetize very, very lowly. Whereas hybrid casual games, we do less downloads, but we monetize better.
Okay, so before we jump into this transition, just to make sure, just to align on the definition, what is a hyper casual game and what is a hybrid casual game?
So a hyper casual game is a very straightforward, engaging gameplay, which tends to be snackable, extremely marketable. A big focus on newness, so innovation. Things that users have never, like gameplays that users have never seen. So that's more on the product side. On the business side of things, it's a game that is extremely marketable, so has a low CPI, and also monetizes through ads, essentially. 99% of revenue comes from ads. On the other hand, hybrid casual games are games that have a more engaging core gameplay. Users tend to stay longer in those games, and the monetization is mixed between in-app purchase and ads, usually 50-50.
Got it. And on design side, so I've tried to kind of like understand myself what is a hybrid casual game, so please correct me if I'm wrong. So I looked at it on 4 different aspects. I looked at design, monetization, marketing, and production. So on the design side, as you said, like a hyper casual core, something that stands out, that is innovative, that looks simple enough. Then you add progression, then you add live ops, and those 2 additions build retention, because in hyper casual, you didn't really have live ops. There was no sense of doing live ops. You just scaled it, put in more people, had them engage for a week, maybe 2, extracted the lifetime value, and then moved them to the rest of your portfolio. Then on monetization side, as you said, in-app ad revenue when it comes to the core monetization, and then in-app purchase revenue when it comes to the meta progression element that has been added. On marketing side, so I guess the goal is to acquire at the price of a hyper casual, but then monetize it with the addition of in-app purchases. And then on the production side, you still keep the low value production, the high speed, the testing that comes in both with the core as well as with the marketing, but then you add also the live ops.
That's a very complete answer. That's correct. I think hybrid casual games are a subset of hyper casual games that can actually monetize through in-app purchase. So they have to have a loop which either you can scale the power of the player and therefore you can limit their growth and make them pay at one point, or the core gameplay, in the core gameplay you can add difficulty, and so then you can also block the player at one point and frustrate them to make them pay. But the player should have a feeling that they have agency. So it's not the game designer that's just limiting their progression, but actually that they didn't make the right strategic choices, and therefore it's kind of their fault, and therefore they're willing to pay to progress.
Interesting. So slowing down the pace of progression by making it more difficult. And then I've noticed that as of late, I don't know how late, but the games that I'm playing, a lot of hybrid casual games are now puzzle games as well. We have that typical level progression and that puzzle monetization mechanic where if I fail, it was just unlucky, but if I win, it was because I was smart. That type of a feeling. And then the ads have been placed right on the board, and it almost makes it necessary to watch the ads. They add so much value to your level progression. So it's interesting how hybrid casual is kind of, the way I'm seeing it, moving from that arcade core to almost any core possible.
That's true. There's a lot of hybrid casual puzzle games. You know, I think the best type of puzzle game is a match 3 game. It's so deep and strategic that there's a kind of a playbook to monetize it, right? And what we're trying to do is trying to find a new type of puzzle games that are also very deep and strategic. We haven't found one that is as good as a match 3, but there's certain like Block Jam that are extremely good, and so we can, you know, through a restrictive economy, we can actually monetize players through in-app purchase. Yeah. That requires a lot of work on level balancing and the economy to do that. So yeah, it's possible, even with a new type of gameplay.
Let's jump in on the most important question from the beginning: the death of hyper casual. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, long story, because we started hyper-casual working on hyper-casual in 2013, but we had an amazing run, 5 years of hyper-growth on a new genre that gaming hadn't seen before. But things ended with Apple's privacy changes, essentially. What happened was that Apple required app developers to ask for explicit consent from players if we wanted to track user data, such as IDFA. IDFA allows ad networks to know which games a player downloaded, to recommend them a game that they would like to play in an ad. And without that data, they couldn't match the right ad with the right player. So what happened was that UA marketing became more expensive, CPIs went up, and at the same time, our ad-based business model was affected because our inventory had less value because we couldn't target the right players. I mean, advertisers couldn't target the right players within our inventory, and therefore CPMs went down. So it had a compression effect on our margins, and so at the end of the day, hyper-casual wasn't a sustainable business anymore.
Interesting. And just to dive a little bit deeper into this, so that I understand correctly, CPI, so cost per install, is CPM, cost per 1,000 impression, divided by installs per 1,000 impression, which is IPM. And what has made hyper-casual games so successful was that the IPM was incredibly high. Whenever you saw the ad, you would download it, you played it, they were accessible, and all of that stuff. And then on the ad model side, and so, I assume that CPM went up because IPM probably stayed the same. So the cost per 1,000 impression went up in the stores.
So yeah, I mean, if we look on the monetization side, the money coming in went down because the inventory had less value. So the CPM went down on the monetization side. On the acquisition side, the CPM went up.
Oh wow! So that's like a double whammy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Damn. And is part of the fact that on the monetization CPM CPM went down is because most of the inventory was sold to other hyper-casual publishers. And so that became much more difficult to track, and that kind of brought down the whole business.
Yeah, so hyper-casual, so we would sell our inventory to hyper-casual publishers, but also casual publishers. For hyper-casual publishers, their margins went down, so they could spend less money, and therefore we made less money. But also for casual publishers, without the IDFA tracking, it was harder for them to target the right players for their games in our inventory, and therefore they spent less money too.
Interesting. And the effects that we're seeing right now in many games, in casual games and as well, is that there's almost double the amount of ads, because the ads are just not bringing the same type of revenue as they're bringing before IDFA deprecation.
That's correct. I mean, in a game that can't monetize with in-app purchase, for example, but can only monetize with ads, the only way you're going to bring up your LTV is to show more ads, essentially. And you have to do that if you want to support the rise in CPI, right? Otherwise, you stop spending marketing and your game collapses. So what happened with a lot of hyper-casual games that had an ad monetization, they would add more ads into their game. Their engagement then therefore went down, and it was kind of a death cycle.
Super interesting. So you said, let's go back to, you said that Voodoo was focusing on hyper-casual games between 2013 and 2018, and that's when the transformation started. 2018, that was before Archero, right?
That was, before Archero.
How come? Like, what did you see where you started making these adjustments?
Yeah, what we saw is that we were kind of capped. In terms of LTV, we were capped due to ads. So we knew that we added to had in-app purchase, and so we started exploring that in 2018. But we explored it with teams that were making hyper-casual games, and so with all our tests, we never really made it. And it's only after like 3 years, 4 years of testing that we finally hired the right people and started making successful games that would monetize through in-app purchase.
Got it. And what the transformation looked like? Like, what does it look like from the team composure perspective? Like, hyper-casual team is probably the one that is just focusing on putting out new prototype every week. And then hybrid casual team is, yes, you have to have the prototyping in the beginning, but the game monetizes through lifetime value, meaning that you have to retain for a longer time, means that you have to have more content, and you have to run live operations to really push the monetization as soon as they get past that day 7. So how did that type of a transformation happen? Because it's a fully different business model.
Yeah, so the mistake we made at the beginning was thinking that the hyper-casual team that built the prototype could do the live ops and continue building the game for the next 5 to 10 years. So we iterated a lot, and what we figured out was that there's two very different skills between finding a new core gameplay and building that really fast versus operating the game on live ops, segmenting users, adding levels, honing the economy, and doing that for a very long amount of time. It's a bit of a sprint versus a marathon. So what we did is we essentially built two types of teams. The first were people that would only look for a prototype. They would prototype a game every week. And then the second types of teams we call live teams would be veterans of the industry, usually bigger teams, around 20 people, that would take their best core prototypes and then build them on to become big hits. So two different types of skills.
Interesting. So you essentially, before it was, you had core developers, so both, and Voodoo is a big publisher, so you had teams internally, but then you have teams externally, probably like 100 different studios that you work with around the world. And then you had growth teams that scaled all these titles, and probably part of growth is monetization. I would assume that monetization is there. And then you added this new function essentially in between them called live. And now once you pass the core phase, you go to a live phase under a different, so once the game passes the core phase, it goes into a live phase where it gets built to sustain live operations and then moves into live operations. And then growth is still working with core and live, or how does it work?
Yeah, so it's true. It was a radical transformation for us.
Yeah.
Firstly, before we used to work with around 700 studios all around the world.
Wow.
So that was before doing hybrid casual games, just on hyper casual We narrowed those teams down to 100 people, 100 teams that could actually build more complex games that would become these hybrid casual games. So working with less people, and then when they build a good prototype, we match them with a live team. And the growth team does the transition. So, there's not much growth work at the beginning, at the prototype stage, even at soft launch stage, because you don't need to create so many creatives. The CPI is usually rather low at the beginning without scale. Yeah. And you also don't want to focus your energy on optimizing CPI. You really just want to build up the LTV. So we don't do much creative work. It's just a UA manager doing campaigns, testing on different networks to see if one network is better than the other, if we can reach better users. And it's really when we transition the game into full launch, so it gets handed over to our live team, where a big growth team starts working on it, making loads of creatives, scaling to loads of geographies, testing on more networks, plugging in more monetization networks, etc.
Interesting. So transitioning, that's the... So we talked about transition in many phases, like transitioning of Voodoo, but also transitioning of a core game to a live operations. So how does that happen? Like, let's say me and my buddies in Finland made this really nice core, and Voodoo said, let's go, this is really nice. We actually tested it. The retention is phenomenal. Day 7 looks good. Day 14 looks really promising. Let's get it into the hands of our live team. What happens next?
So it takes around 6 to 9 months. So once we test a prototype and we have promising metrics, what we look for is retention, a CPI that's not too high. It's not the most important factor, but you don't want it to be $10 either, because that just means that it's not marketable, that the gameplay is not new enough. On retention, by the way, we'll look for day 1 retention around 50% and day 7 retention at the prototype stage around 15%, let's say. That shows that there's potential.
Okay.
So once we have that, we go on to the soft launch stage. The core studio still keeps the game. And they get helped by a team that we have in-house called Launch Ops, which is kind of like the engineering counterpart for publishing. And there's also artists in that team. And we kind of coach the studio, the core studio, to add loads of best practices into the game, whether it's a battle game or a puzzle game. We'll look at the economy, add better levels, work on difficulty. We're not going to add loads of meta features. We're not going to do any meta. We're just going to focus just on the core, but make that core perfect and get that loop perfect. So that can take 3 months. We add in monetization.
Add SDKs.
Add SDKs. We also start putting like basic offers in there. What we're looking for is a ROAS, which is predicted ROAS of 150%. A 120-day predicted ROAS of 150%.
Okay.
Right? That tells us that this game is sustainable, and we grow the spend with that target in mind to around 5 to 10K. So it also shows us if the game is able to scale a minimum, or does CPI just go crazy once you add a bit of budget. Once we validate that, it goes into full launch. We grow the scale. We then match the game with a live team that takes over gradually, starts adding features, live ops, etc. And we'll go on from that. And then we try grow the scale as much as possible. We're usually growing by 10K per month.
Got it. So, okay, very clear. So you look at the shape of the curve and shape of the curve meaning the shape of the LTV curve versus the customer acquisition curve, and that's where you kind of start seeing the 150. You're not expecting it to be like in any type of a mid-core or a casual game where it's like never ending and kind of like going constantly up. You're fine with it plateauing, but as long as it plateaus at around 150%.
Exactly. A proxy is, by the way, is day 30 retention. We look for 10% day 30 retention. Means that there's a core group of players that really enjoy the experience and are going to stay there for a long amount of time. We don't need, we just wanted to see the curve plateauing, because we know that if we have good basics, good fundamentals, then we can grow that through live ops, segmentation, etc.
To 2x and so forth.
Exactly.
Or 90 days to 150.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then I have a couple of questions here. So with this transition part, at what point does the core team lose access to what they've built? Or do they ever?
It takes time. I think a full transition can take up to 18 months. The core team, these are the people who created the core gameplay. They usually have very deep insights on difficulties, what type of levels are the good levels. There's a lot of innovation in there too. There's no playbook, right? So it's really important that the core team stays on and works hand in hand with the live team. However, in transition, it's really important that there be one single decision maker on a game. When you have two captains, it doesn't work and things go slow. So you need to say, okay, at full launch, the live team general manager is now the sole decision maker, but that general manager will work with the core team, right? So it's a long transition, and I would say after 18 months, there's no point for the core team to still work on the game, and they usually prefer going back to prototyping. That's really their forte. They prototype, and that's what they like to do. So they go back to prototyping. They usually go on the calls, follow the roadmap, give it some opinions, but after a while, they stop doing that.
This is a very mature way of making games. Like, I mean, Scopely probably is a good example of that. Supercell seems to be functioning that way now, and a lot of other studios are finally recognizing that these are totally different skill sets, making new games and operating games. It's like, it's a different job.
Absolutely. I think what's important is that it's very clear from the get-go.
Yeah.
When you tell a team, if it's not clear for them that they're going to hand over the game, then they get very disappointed. If it's your baby, you always want to, and it's successful, you always want to keep it, right? But from the get-go, we tell studios, what do you want to work on? Do you want to work on prototypes? It's going to be very, very hard to do that. Is that your skill set? If it is, you should focus just on that. Or do you want to work on live games? In that case, you're probably not going to start prototyping because that is also extremely, that's very hard. But you're only going to, you're going to wait for a diamond in the rough to arrive, and then you're going to polish that diamond and make it into something huge. And there's a lot of people who like doing that too.
And then you have both internal core teams, so studios owned by Voodoo, and then you have external, so studios that are being published by Voodoo. What is, like, the contract part is the most important part with the publishing work. How do you make sure, because like, the way I would think about it is I mean, the Scopely model is probably the best, where as soon as the game passes a certain threshold, I think for them it's going global, then they just simply acquire the studio. And after that, everybody's on their same roof and everything is clear. And I've been in companies where we were working with an external studio, and once the game starts scaling and making more money, that's when the arguments start. It's like, whose money is this? And like, well, I'm investing into UA. Well, I'm doing this, so we should be getting a cut and so forth. Kind of like those type of problems arise. How do you escape those problems?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing publishing for 10 years now, so we know how to communicate with studios to make contracts very clear. And it just comes down to being, upfront from the very beginning. There's a contract in place. What happens usually is, a revenue share split during a certain phase of the game when the core studio has the game. But when it gets handed over to the live team, the revenue share is going to be diminished, right? Because there's more cost associated to that project. So it just has to be very clear from the beginning. We work with external studios. Around 70% of our core studios are external. 30% are internal. It doesn't really matter to us. What's important is just finding the right talent and then figuring out how can we work with them. Certain talent want to stay entrepreneurs and raise money with investors and do all of that. Other talents want to just focus on the product. They don't want to do the finance part. They don't want to raise. And so we just say, hey, like, probably the best solution for you is to become an internal studio. You're not going to have to do anything else than work on product. And certain people like that.
Is there a lot of studios that are, looking forward to working with Voodoo? Like, I mean, you went from 700 to 100 studios. It seems like it. Like, how do you identify them? I think that's a better question. Like, how do you identify a studio you want to work with? Because there are so many.
I think that's the $1 billion question. I think it's even more important than how do you make a hit game, is how do you identify and build a hit studio? There's a few common aspects to amazing core studios. The first thing is these are people whose life mission is to make games. They don't have a plan apart from making games. I usually ask studio directors, what would you do if in 10 years, if everything went well? And if they say, hey, I'm going to be, I would love to go into cinema, or I'd like to, I don't know, like start a VC fund.
Yeah.
And I say like, hey, why don't you do that now, instead of building a studio? So the best studios are people whose life mission is to make an iconic game. The second thing is, for core studios, it's really small teams. So the talent usually has to have several skills. So the studio director is usually an engineer or an artist, and each talent in the team, which is around 4 people, 5 people max, should either be like either their product and data, or their engineering and data, or their art and product. They usually have several skills, kind of generalists. And yeah, those are the only 2 things I can see in common between studios, because otherwise they're all over the world.
Yeah.
They come from loads of different backgrounds. We've tested people that come from consulting, not at all gamers. Some work, some make it. There's a lot of talent that come from hyper-casual games. Other talent that comes from casual games and converted towards hybrid. So it can come from everywhere.
Except AAA.
No, I've never seen that.
Yeah, that's such a different way,
Very different way
of making stuff. Do you think that an individual studio like a small studio, can become successful these days in 2024 as a hybrid casual developer and publisher?
It's possible, but they probably have to be very lucky. Today, the market is so much more complicated. Firstly, to build a new good core prototype, you have to test probably 100 prototypes. So you're going to have a lot of runway to do that, right? And if you're doing that alone, you're not going to benefit from the learnings that a big publisher will have. That prototypes and tests hundreds of prototypes per month. So it's just going to take more time to find that product, that good product. Second thing is doing marketing and ad monetization has become way more complex post IDFA, post Apple privacy changes, and building that whole stack is quite unattainable to a small studio.
Okay, so one core is 100 prototypes on average.
Essentially.
Yeah, yes, as you said, you have to get lucky. But let's talk about your operations. What is your volume? Like if one core requires 100 prototypes, how many games do you have in core phase simultaneously?
Simultaneously, we have around 100 prototypes being prototyped at any given time. We test around 1,000 prototypes per year. Out of those 1,000 prototypes, around 10%, so 100 prototypes per year, get iterated on. We see potential, we start adding more levels, tweaking the economy, etc. Out of those 100, I'd say 30%, so around 30, go into a soft launch phase. We start adding more budget to the campaigns. We open up different networks. And out of those 30 games, around 4 really make it to full launch. And one of them is going to become a big hit that can sustain probably 100 million run rate in revenue per year.
Okay, so 0.4% hit rate, essentially.
Yeah.
So this is a volume
0.1 for a big hit.
What is out of those 4? What is a hit and what is a big hit in terms of, let's say, daily revenue or yearly revenue?
Yeah. So for yearly, because it fluctuates a lot depending on the month and also day of the week. For yearly revenue, I'd say around 100 million revenue. With a healthy profit margin, because we don't only look at revenue, we also look at margins.
Yes.
For us, a 40% margin is good, even a 50% is better. And that would be, we're satisfied with that, we're happy with that. Though we're now striving to build games that will be hitting more than 1 billion mark.
Interesting, so 40 million is an EBITDA essentially on a title.
Yeah.
and you're trying to ship at least one of those a year. And then if it's a smaller title, are we talking about 10 million to 15 million EBITDA?
10 to 15 million gross margin. But those will really be our priority too. And we'll always be waiting for that big hit to come, and then we'll switch the studio towards a high potential game.
And then, so these are like the advantages that you get only through scale, this volume advantages. Is it like, and you mentioned something that because you have this volume, because you have this data, how do you coach your studios to use this data? Because a lot of, like, I've worked with a lot of companies, they have the knowledge, but they're not very good at sharing that knowledge. It's like the knowledge inside a few people's heads. How does it work at Voodoo?
Yeah, so we have a team of publishing managers. We have 10 publishing managers that coach studios every single day. They do around 8 calls per day. And they coach studios through essentially a Socratic method. Like you can't really tell a studio what the answer is because no one really knows what the secret source to a hit is, right? So what we do is we let them test new ideas but we give them all the learnings that we have from all the tests that we've done. And with each test, we try to figure out like what didn't work, what was good, to prepare for the next test. And we do that in a very iterative manner, and it will take, essentially up to 9 months before a studio can find a promising game. We also recognize that we need to train studios, so we will create small teams of around 4 people, and then we have to train them, and that training can take up to 1 year. And it goes through different phases of benchmarking, testing games that are relatively simple, then more complex, and so it will take really time before somebody can get to the level that they've become an independent, good core studio.
Super interesting. What is the culture at Voodoo like? Because when you look outside, this is a tech office. There's no Voodoo signs anywhere. Nobody's playing games. People are, chilling and having fun and so forth, but this is not a gaming studio. So can you talk about like how this office reflects the culture of Voodoo?
Sure. I mean, first thing is this is HQ, right? So this is publishing, growth, engineering, and data teams. The studios themselves are remote. They have their own offices with their own, vibe, culture, all around the world. But here, it's true that we're very much focused on a few things. So the first thing, and we want to reflect that through our offices. So the first thing is we are extremely performance-driven. We really look to make big games and big business, right? But that culture comes with a big side of ownership too. Product teams have ownership over their roadmaps. They also get a big percentage of profit. They get up to 10% of the profit of a game if they're successful. Essentially, anybody who touches product at Voodoo, we want them to be able to become a millionaire in around 3-4 years if they make a good product. And finally, one thing that really characterizes us, and I think that differentiates us, is that we are focused on innovation. To give you an example, on products, we're not really in this vision of taking a successful game, let's say Match 3 or Tiles, and then iterating upon that. What we try to do is look for the space that's adjacent, that no one has explored. And that's what we try to do with our 100 core studios, always prototyping new gameplays that no one has ever seen, because we really believe that's where we'll find long-term success.
So performance, ownership, and innovation. Yeah. Is this typical for a French company? Because people outside France would have a specific perception of a French company. Is Voodoo a typical French tech company?
There are good French tech companies now on the scene.
France is quite the, even looking at the investment side, a lot of investments in the Western Europe is going actually into French gaming studios and tech companies. So I'm asking out of interest because, this is quite booming.
Yeah, I mean, our culture has, of course, been very inspired by, Silicon Valley companies like Facebook and a bit like Google too. And then we've created our own culture, right? And I'd say a lot of startups in Paris that are more tech startups have this a similar culture. But gaming studios are usually very different, right? And it's not the same culture. However, if you talk to any French company in the scene today, they always tell you that, yeah, Voodoo is very unique.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Another thing about French companies is that people assume that they only speak French at a French company. Is that also the case at Voodoo?
Not at all. The main language we speak is English. We speak English in all meetings. We have around 40 nationalities at Voodoo. And yeah, we've switched. I mean, yeah, we switched from French to English around 6 years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay. And why did you switch? Are you running out of the talent pool, or like, are you scaling still? Like, what are the ambitions and the hiring that is happening in Voodoo?
Yeah, we want to hire the best people, the best talent around the world, right? And there's a limited pool in France. There's really good engineers, really good artists in France, but yeah, it's limited, right? So we're going a lot to Turkey, Israel, Eastern Europe to hire good talent. These people speak English, so we have to be working with them.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Gabriel. This was very insightful. I ran out of all my questions. The floor is yours. What would you like to tell our listeners?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, the market has really changed in these past few years. We've transitioned ourselves from hyper-casual to hybrid, and now moving towards casual. We've tested over 20,000 games. Those 20,000 games, there's a couple that have become successful. To give you examples, Mob Control and Block Jam, both on 100 million run rate at the moment per year. And I think that the message I want to get through is that what we're looking for is talented GMs that have general managers that have the will to build iconic games, that want to work on the prototypes that we've really filtered down, that we know have potential, and scale them towards big games. These people need to have this performance-driven mindset and should be willing to take over the ownership over the game. And what we promise these GMs is that they will have ownership over the roadmap, but also ownership over the profits of the game.
Thank you so much for doing the interview, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thanks, Michael.